6 Eastern on CNN. This is CNN Breaking News.
Hello, I'm Wolf Blitzer in Washington. We're following breaking news. We want to welcome our viewers in the United States and around the world. We have just learned that President Obama is about to step into the White House briefing room. There you see the reporters, the producers, the camera crews, they're all getting ready. The president is going to make a statement, we're told, on Ukraine. Now, this is a surprise addition to the president's schedule. We don't know what he is going to say, but let's bring in our White House correspondent, Michelle Kaczynski. Only moments ago, they alerted us that the president would be walking into the briefing room. Michelle, this is an important day. Lots going on. Set the scene for us. Unfortunately, Michelle is no longer there, but we're going to reconnect with her. We just lost her for a moment. Jim Sciutto, our chief national security correspondent, is here. I'm told Jim to stand by for a minute. Michelle is now ready. Michelle, are you there?
I hear you now, Wolf. Hopefully you can hear me.
Set the stage for us, because as our viewers have just been told, the president is about to make a statement on Ukraine. What do we know?
Right, we expect to hear from him soon. And I mean, events are happening quickly. Now we're hearing from Russia after the foreign minister met with other leaders today in Rome, saying that he did not find common ground with the West. And he was going to take the suggestions that Secretary of State Kerry made to him to sit down and talk to Ukraine, to let in international observers, take those back to President Putin, and then make a decision from there. He didn't respond directly to the sanctions that were imposed by the U.S. today, with the president signing this executive order targeting individuals that would be deemed by the U.S. government to have undermined democracy in Ukraine, threatened security, misappropriated state funds, or exerted authority without authorization from the government of Ukraine. He also makes it put a prohibition on funding this kind of activity, and also visa bans, not letting people into the United States, as well as revoking visas. Senior administration officials told us today that they were still working on the asset bans as to who exactly would be targeted. But when it comes to the visas, they already had a list of people who would not be able to gain access to the U.S. And if they're already here or already had a visa, those would be revoked, and they're being notified now, Wolf.
And so the president presumably will be elaborating on that. We don't know if he has a major announcement to make, but he does want to speak about the situation in Ukraine. That's why they have literally just moments ago alerted the news media that the president will walk into the briefing room and make that statement. Jim Sciutto, our chief national security correspondent, is here. Gloria Borger is here as well, chief political analyst. It's not every day that the president all of a sudden says, you know what, I want to speak to the American people, indeed the world, and let them know something. We don't know what he's about to say.
No question. It'll be interesting to hear what he has to say, because you have this diplomatic path that is underway in Rome and Europe, led by Secretary of State John Kerry, but it's stumbling at this point. As Michelle noted, the foreign minister of Russia saying in public that he has not found common ground with the U.S. on a way forward, and they can't even find and agree on the format for getting the Ukrainian foreign minister involved in these talks. As you know, since yesterday, this has been the goal of Secretary of State John Kerry. He carried him on his plane from Kiev to Paris, hoping he could get Lavrov and the Ukrainian foreign minister in the same room. He hasn't been able to do that, and the word today is they're still working on a format. So I think the danger here is that we're getting in the stage where there are talks about talks. And what are those talks producing? Meanwhile, at the same time, you have facts on the ground in the Ukraine, in Crimea, that are, with each day passing, become more established facts on the ground. And the fact is that Russia has those troops on the ground. Russia is establishing control. You have political moves now taking place in Crimea, a vote coming up talking about autonomy and so on. So the longer you talk without progress...
Hold on one second, Gloria, because Jim Acosta is over in the briefing room right now. He's getting some more information. Jim, what are you learning?
Wolf just talked to a senior administration official in the last few moments. You'll have to pardon me there. Everybody's getting set in here in the briefing room. But a senior administration official just told us a few moments ago not to expect any major announcements from the president, but that he will reinforce basically where the administration stands this morning with respect to Ukraine, with respect to Russia. I suspect he will talk about those sanctions. We'll talk about those visa bans that Michelle and Jim just talked about. But one of the crucial questions at this hour, Wolf, is the unfolding situation in Crimea from a political standpoint. standpoint. This talk of perhaps that they might try to seek to become part of Russia and that they may be voting on this. Ukraine has obviously said they're opposed to that, and now the State Department has said no, that is not going to happen unless Ukraine, the government in Kiev, signs off on that. And so there is sort of a diplomatic political question here for this president. We'll have to wait and see if he addresses that as well. But we're hearing from the White House, from a senior administration official, that this is sort of reinforcing where things stand now. He may talk about John Kerry, talk about the diplomatic efforts that Jim and everybody has talked about. And here's the president.
Hold on, Jim. Here comes the president. Let's listen in.
Good afternoon, everybody. Before Jay takes some of your questions, I wanted to provide a brief update on our efforts to address the ongoing crisis in Ukraine. Since the Russian intervention, we've been mobilizing the international community to condemn this violation of international law and to support the people and government of Ukraine. This morning, I signed an executive order that authorizes sanctions on individuals and entities responsible for violating the sovereignty and territorial integrity of Ukraine or for stealing the assets of the Ukrainian people. According to my guidance, the State Department has also put in place restrictions on the travel of certain individuals and officials. These decisions continue our efforts to impose a cost on Russia and those responsible for the situation in Crimea. And they also give us the flexibility to adjust our response going forward based on Russia's actions. We took these steps in close coordination with our European allies. I've spoken to several of our closest friends around the world, and I'm pleased that our international unity is on display at this important moment. Already we've moved together to announce substantial assistance for the government in Kiev. And today in Brussels, our allies took similar steps to impose costs on Russia. I am confident that we are moving forward together, united in our determination to oppose actions that violate international law and to support the government and people of Ukraine. And that includes standing up for the principle of state sovereignty. The proposed referendum on the future of Crimea would violate the Ukrainian Constitution and violate international law. Any discussion about the future of Ukraine must include the legitimate government of Ukraine. In 2014, we are well beyond the days when borders can be redrawn over the heads of democratic leaders. While we take these steps, I want to be clear that there is also a way to resolve this crisis that respects the interests of the Russian Federation, as well as the Ukrainian people. Let international monitors into all of Ukraine, including Crimea, to ensure the rights of all Ukrainians are being respected, including ethnic Russians. Begin consultations between the government of Russia and Ukraine with the participation of the international community. Russia would maintain its basing rights in Crimea, provided that it abides by its agreements and respects Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity. And the world should support the people of Ukraine as they move to elections in May. That's the path of de-escalation. And Secretary Kerry is engaged in discussions with all of the relevant parties, including Russia and Ukraine, to pursue that path. But if this violation of international law continues, the resolve of the United States and our allies and the international community will remain firm. Meanwhile, we've taken steps to reaffirm our commitment to the security and democracy of our allies in Eastern Europe and to support the people of Ukraine. One last point. There's been a lot of talk in Congress about these issues. Today, once again, I'm calling on Congress to follow up on these words with action, specifically to support the IMF's capacity to lend resources to Ukraine and to provide American assistance for the Ukrainian government so that they can weather this storm and stabilize their economy, make needed reforms, deliver for their people, all of which will provide a smoother pathway for the elections that have already been scheduled in May. Today, the world can see that the United States is united with our allies and partners in upholding international law and pursuing a just outcome that advances global security and the future that the Ukrainian people deserve. That's what we're going to continue to do in the days to come until we have seen a resolution to this crisis. Thanks very much, and Jay and Ben and others will be happy to take your questions.
Do you think Putin's unstable? Vladimir Putin, directly Putin listening to you, sir?
So there you have the President of the United States making a very strong statement that was seen not only here in the United States, but around the world, especially in Moscow. He was clearly making the point that there is a way out diplomatically, but in the meantime, the U.S. will start using sanctions as a way to get involved and make sure that Russia does not formally take over part of sovereign Ukraine, which would be Crimea. Let's bring in Nicholas Burns, the former U.S. diplomat who's been watching from Harvard University. So Nick, this looks like this is a standoff. For all practical purposes, I think this referendum that they've scheduled in the coming days in Crimea to become formally part of Russia, that train is leaving the station, although the president says flatly that would be a violation of international law.
Well, the president's correct about that. And Wolf, I think you're hearing from the president of the United States deep frustration over the unwillingness of the Russian government to meet anybody halfway here. A referendum in Crimea on March 16th would be farcical, because no people can have a free vote when they're being occupied by a foreign military force. And indeed, Wolf, recent public opinion polls in the last couple of months in Crimea seem to indicate that a lot of people in Crimea want to stay with Ukraine. So we've got to oppose that. And you saw, Wolf, that the president put forward and announced again these sanctions. If the U.S. and EU can work in tandem, if they both can push sanctions, there's a chance that they could raise the cost to President Putin for what's happened.
Are these sanctions that were announced by the president and the White House today, are they really going to make any difference in terms of affecting Putin's thinking?
You know, I think Putin is confirmed in his strategy. He's trying to keep Ukraine in the orbit of Russia. That's why he invaded Crimea, and that's why he's trying to intimidate the new government in Ukraine. He's used the same tactics, as you know, with Georgia in 2008, with Moldova, with Armenia. And so he's trying to recreate this Russian near abroad. I don't think the sanctions will change his behavior, but they're going to further isolate him, and they're going to impose some costs. And it's very important that there be this economic and political pushback by Germany, by the United States, and the rest of Europe on Russia.
That's critically important. I know you got to run. Nick Burns, thanks very much. The retired U.S. diplomat now at the Kennedy School at Harvard, Jim Sciutto, Gloria Borger, they're with me right now. So you heard the president. We all heard the president, Jim. Very strong statement. The key question, he says that he thinks the allies can work together. He's confident that the U.S. and the Europeans can work together. Is that confidence well born, shall we say?
Well, you did have a statement today from the European Council President Herman Van Rompuy saying that the EU would impose sanctions as well if Moscow doesn't change its ways there, but that, of course, has to be backed up with action. It appears the spark for the president's comments today was that referendum, this idea of a March 16th referendum for independence in Crimea, but also, as Nick Burns said, his frustration. I mean, the paths that so far the president has chosen as their strategy for this, unified sanctions, they're not moving very quickly at this point. The diplomatic path, as we were talking before the president came on, they're still talking about the format for talks. And meanwhile, as they're talking about talks, the facts on the ground are being further established.
Well, and you say the facts on the ground are being established. What I think you mean by that is that there's Russian domination of Crimea no matter what occurs in this referendum. And I think what you're hearing from the president, reading between the lines, is, look, as Nick Burns says, it's a farce. It's illegitimate. We know in advance what the outcome of this referendum is going to be, so I'm going to tell you before the vote that it doesn't really matter. But in essence, no matter what vote occurs, to a certain degree, Putin has accomplished what he set out to accomplish, which is to establish his dominance there, and sort of no matter what else occurs. And I think that's what's sort of frustrating the administration and frustrating the president.
Here's my question to both of you. It looks to me like John Kerry, the Secretary of State, doesn't seem to be making much progress in his talks with Sergei Lavrov, the Russian foreign minister. Otherwise, the U.S. would not have released these sanctions, announced all these sanctions that were announced today. The president would not be going out in the middle of intensive diplomacy, making a strong statement like this. It looks like maybe the president thinks that this kind of tough talk and tough action from the U.S. can help Kerry. Others will say, well, Kerry doesn't seem to be doing much anyhow, so the U.S. might as well start taking those kinds of actions.
Well, we'll see. I mean, Sergei Lavrov says that he has has to go back to Russia now to discuss the format of these talks for talking to the Ukrainian Prime Minister. Listen, if you're going to talk to the Ukrainian Prime Minister, you can make that decision on the ground. You can make a phone call back to Moscow. It appears that they're dragging this out. And, you know, talking about what Russia has accomplished here. Stephen Hadley, former National Security Advisor for President Bush, was on the air last night. He made a very good point about the strategy. It's not just about military action. It's about Russia establishing these territorial question marks in these various countries. They did it in Georgia. They have those 2 provinces, breakaway provinces. They're doing it now here. That makes it impossible for a country like Ukraine to join the EU or join NATO because they have these territorial questions. That's a success.
So the more ambiguous you make it, the better it is for Russia, and that's the problem that they're confronting in the administration.
The president was pretty blunt right now. He didn't want to take questions from reporters, leaving that to his White House press secretary, Jay Carney. But the president says there will be a cost on Russia. He's confident the allies can work together. And as far as the United States is concerned, there is a sovereign country of Ukraine, which includes Crimea. And Crimea is not going to split off as far as the U.S. and the European Union are concerned, although for all practical purposes, it looks like the Russians are controlling. You were watching Russian TV, and what are they already showing?
Well, they show Crimea as part of in their map. They show Crimea as part of Russia already. Right. You know, that's a fait accompli. It's a fact on the ground as far as Russian TV is concerned. Yeah. And you know, speaking about frustration with Kerry and Lavrov, remember this is just a month ago. Syria talks, right? Which, you know, the Secretary Kerry had invested an enormous amount of time and diplomatic capital in.
With Lavrov,
a key partner. Depending on Lavrov's leverage against Bashar al-Assad, those didn't go anywhere either. So 2 times in a row, you've had this immense frustration with Russia.
And the interesting thing to me also about what the president said today is that he was calling upon Congress to move forcefully with sanctions, et cetera, et cetera. He doesn't really have to do that. Congress is already moving on its own and pretty quickly, but I think he's...
All right, hold on a second. John Kerry, the Secretary of State, now about to speak himself.
Buonasera a tutti, è un vero piacere tornare a Roma. Good evening, everybody. It's a great pleasure for me to be back in Rome. I'm especially pleased to be here in Rome at a time when Italy is making a transition with a new government and making progress, important progress on growing its economy and tackling unemployment. Tonight I will have the pleasure of meeting with Italy's new Foreign Minister, Foreign Minister Mogherini, and I'm hopeful. We were supposed to also be joined by the Prime Minister, but he's on his way back from Brussels, maybe a little bit delayed. We hope he can make it. I want to assure our Italian friends that the United States intends to continue to deepen our economic and security partnership with this government, including our shared commitment to negotiating an ambitious transatlantic trade and partnership, investment partnership agreement. We believe that such an agreement would be enormously helpful to all of our economies, good for Europe, good for the United States. It will create jobs. It can help create wealth. And at this time, the global economy needs that kind of trade partnership. President Obama, as you know, will be here shortly at the end of March, and I look forward to joining him here at that time in order to talk about these valuable partnerships and many other issues. The reason that my counterparts and I came to Rome today was to demonstrate our commitment all together, a huge number of countries that came together to demonstrate our commitment to Libya's democratic transition. And we recognize that this is really a pivotal moment for Libya as it drafts a post-revolution constitution and moves towards national reconciliation and elections. I can tell you that we in America, who are still perfecting our democracy and working and struggling to make it work as effectively as possible, and it goes up and down, as we all know, we very well know from our own history the difficulties we had centuries ago in developing our Constitution and giving it full bloom, that this is hard work. It doesn't happen overnight, and it is something that takes devotion and commitment and courage. I think today we heard from the Prime Minister and the President of Libya their dedication to helping to make this transition work. We also know that Libyans did not risk their lives in the 2011 revolution just to slip backward into thuggery and violence. And as I told President Abu Zamein today, as well as Prime Minister Zaidan, we have no illusions about the challenges ahead, but we are committed to work very, very closely with the government of Libya, but also with our partners. And Italy is one of the central partners in the effort to help Libya in this transition, together with France, Great Britain, Germany, and others. And we will continue to work closely to fight terrorism, to prevent the spread of conventional weapons and to secure those weapons where they should be secured, and to build democratic institutions. Now let me say a word about a subject that I know is on everybody's mind, and that's the question of Ukraine. Just a few moments ago, President Obama spoke in Washington and laid out the steps that he has ordered with respect to this situation at this time, which are in keeping with precisely what we said last week we would do as a consequence of the steps that Russia decided to take with respect to Crimea. As you have heard me say all week, the choices that Russia has made escalated this situation, and we believe that Russia has the opportunity now, together with the rest of us, but Russia particularly has the opportunity now to make the right choices in order to de-escalate. The United States also has choices to make, and President Obama has been clear that we cannot allow Russia or any country to defy international law with impunity. There's no place in the community of nations for the kind of aggression and steps that we have seen taken in Crimea and Ukraine in these last days. So today, as we announced we would last week, we have taken specific steps, and the State Department also has taken specific steps in response to what has occurred. Starting today, at President Obama's direction, the State Department is putting in place tough visa restrictions on a number of officials and other individuals. And the United States will not grant visas to those who threaten the sovereignty or territorial integrity of Ukraine, and if they already have one, it will be revoked in those individual cases. Now let me remind you that this decision comes on top of our existing policy to deny visas to those who are involved in human rights abuses or political oppression in Ukraine. And it is also on top of other steps that the United States has already taken, which we have announced. Now, at the same time, President Obama has issued an executive order that gives the Treasury Department the legal framework to sanction those who threaten Ukraine's sovereignty, security, and democracy. Those who contribute to the misappropriation of Ukraine's state assets. And, just as importantly, those who try to assert government authority over any part of Ukraine without authorization from the legitimate government in Kiev. I want to emphasize, and there's a reason why only the legal framework was put in place and not the specific designations. And that reason is that even as we will keep faith with what we have said we would do, we want to be able to have the dialogue that leads to the de-escalation. We want to be able to continue the intense discussions with both sides in order to try to normalize and end this crisis. And we will absolutely consider, if we have to, additional steps beyond what we've done, but our preference, and the President has said this and I have said this, is to emphasize the possibilities for the dialogue that can lead to the normalization and defusing of this crisis. Now, yesterday in Paris, we had lengthy discussions, and we met also, obviously, with our Ukrainian counterpart, the Foreign Minister of Ukraine, and discussed with him Ukrainian thoughts about what should form the centerpiece of our approach to this effort to negotiate. And with the Ukrainian view in mind, and with the input of all of our allies in the European community, we have made suggestions to Foreign Minister Lavrov, which he is currently taking personally to President Putin in Sochi, I believe. And we have agreed to stay in close touch in order to see if there is a way forward, try to get to the negotiating table with the parties necessary to be able to stabilize this. We've been in very close touch all day with our European counterparts, both those who were here in Rome as well as by telephone for those who were in Brussels. And we agreed that over the course of the next hours, next days, there is an imperative to try to move quickly in order to prevent mistake or misinterpretation or any other measures that might preclude our opportunity to be able to find the political solution that we believe is the best way to proceed. The Ukrainian people, we are convinced, beyond any doubt whatsoever, want nothing more than the right to determine their own future. And they want to be able to live freely in a safe and prosperous country where they can make the choices that people make in other countries around the world. And they have the international community's full support. And while we reserve the right to take steps beyond those things that were announced today, we want President Putin and Russia and everyone to understand our preference is to get back to a normality and get back to a place where the rights of the people of Ukraine will be respected and the territorial integrity and sovereignty of the nation will be respected. The United States will continue to stand with the Ukrainian people, as will our allies and friends in the European community and elsewhere, in order to stand up for the values that we all believe in our fellow, that define our fellow democracies. So thank you very, very much, and I look forward to the opportunity to take a couple questions.
Great, thank you. The first question is from Elise Labott of CNN.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary. You said that the Ukrainian people have the right to determine their own future. Does that include the people of Crimea? Don't they have the right to determine their own future? Are there any conditions under which the U.S. might accept a referendum as part of the solution? And then on your meeting with Foreign Minister Lavrov, Minister Fabius said that he's forming this contact group and that the Russians might agree. Did you talk about this with the minister, and do you see this as a useful mechanism that might happen in the coming days? And lastly, I'm wondering if you talked to him about the fact that he told you last week that the exercises that the Russians were doing had nothing to do with Ukraine. We now know that that was a pretext to mask the Russian intervention.
What was the first part of that question? I'm sorry.
Well, we understand.
We now know what?
Well, we know that this exercise did have a lot to do with Ukraine, and perhaps it was a pretext for Russia to go into the Crimea. I'm just wondering, you've invested a lot in your relationship with Minister Lavrov, and I'm wondering if you feel misled by him at all, and whether you spoke with him about that. Thank you.
Well, let me take the first part of that question. Crimea is part of Ukraine. Crimea is Ukraine. And we support the territorial integrity of Ukraine, and the government of Ukraine needs to be involved in any kind of decision with respect to any part of Ukraine. Any referendum on Ukraine is going to have to be absolutely consistent with Ukrainian law. And it's my understanding that the Constitution of Ukraine requires an all-Ukraine referendum. In other words, every part of Ukraine, all Ukrainians would have to be part of a referendum with respect to the territory of Ukraine. So therefore, the proposed referendum would violate the Constitution of Ukraine and international law and the sovereignty of Ukraine itself. If it adheres to the Constitution of Ukraine, it's up to Ukrainians to define that. It's not up to the United States or Russia to make that decision. Ukrainians need to live by Ukrainian law and according to the Constitution. And their Constitution would require precisely what I just said. So that is, I think, critical to anything that would flow. Secondly, with respect to a contact group and where we're proceeding, frankly, I think everybody has been working to put a contact group together. I think it's been a general assumption of all of us in unity that we would like to see if a contact group can be put together. And I think that the key here is whether or not that is going to be something that will work in the context of Russia's willingness to do this, and obviously Ukrainian views about this. Thus far, the Ukrainian government has expressed their desire to have the support of a contact group, providing, of course, that the government, that Russia is dealing with them in that context. This can't be in lieu of the respect for the existing government of Ukraine. And we don't intend for it to be, and none of us who have been part of the discussions about a contact group view this as anything except supportive of the process. But I believe there is a way to structure this, and that is obviously part of what we are now engaged in discussions with Russia through Foreign Minister Lavrov and to Mr. Putin. With respect to the relationship with Foreign Minister Lavrov, it's professional, as all my relationships are with any foreign minister. There are moments in the course of a meeting over a year where you may be able to laugh at something, and there are moments where you disagree, and disagree very strongly. And we work professionally, both of us, to represent our countries, represent our point of views, and try to get the work of diplomacy done. This is obviously a moment where we have disagreement, as we do on some other issues. But where we can, we try to find a way forward, whether it's been on chemical weapons in Syria or with respect to Iran and P5+1, or the enforcement of the START Treaty and other kinds of issues, Afghanistan and other things. So we will continue to work in a professional manner in order to try to resolve those issues that come to us, and to try to do so in a way that advances the global interests of peace and stability and security. And that's what I'm trying to do. So, another question.
Great. Our final question comes from Oliviero Bergamini from TG1. Thank you.
Mr. Secretary. Are you satisfied with the way the European Union is dealing with this crisis? Because there seems to be quite a distance between countries like Poland, that are really close to the position of the United States, and countries like Germany and Italy to some extent. They get a lot of their energy supplies from Russia. They seem to be much softer on the theme of economic sanctions and so on. That's actually the reason why Prime Minister Renzi might be late for dinner, because they're not finding an agreement right now in Brussels.
Well, actually, they did announce an agreement in Brussels.
But there was some tension. How do you see the attitude of the European Union?
I think the European Union has been extremely cooperative and has been a partner in this thoroughly. There's been a complete and total communication and sharing of information and sharing of ideas. I do not believe there is a gap. There may be some differences of opinion about timing or about one particular choice versus another. That's not unusual when you have as many countries working together as we do. But fundamentally, with respect to the question of what has happened and the need to protect the territorial integrity and sovereignty of Ukraine, there is no difference whatsoever. With respect to the need to have some sanctions as a result of what has happened in Crimea, there is no difference whatsoever. And Europe, on its own tonight, has made its announcement through its own process and own debate that they have taken some steps. Now, Europe joins us in absolutely believing that we are all better served by getting back to a normality and a stability that will come through good diplomacy and good efforts to try to find a path forward that can protect the territorial integrity of Ukraine, protect legitimate interests where they exist of ethnic Russians and or of other agreements like the base agreement and other things that Russia has that are in law. Those are things that we can deal with. And our hope is that together, Europe, the United States, and others, Canada, Japan, there are a lot of countries interested in what is happening. And I think they all want to be supportive for a process that de-escalates, that reduces tension. We have a lot of things to do together. We do not need to be distracted or split apart by virtue of what has happened in Ukraine. I think it is fair to say, and I have said, that Russia does have some interests in the region, but they need to be dealt with according to law and in a proper way, and dealt with in a way that can respect the integrity of the country, and that's what we're trying to do. At the same time, the Ukrainian people have an overriding interest, paramount interest here, in having their rights protected, their sovereignty protected, their hopes and aspirations, which they died to achieve, that needs to be respected. And that's the tension here, and that's what we're trying to balance as we approach a diplomatic and peaceful resolution of this rather than an escalation that could harm the efforts of a lot of other initiatives that we all are focused on. Thank you all very much. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
So there he is, the Secretary of State, John Kerry, also making a strong statement saying Crimea is Ukraine. There is no difference between Crimea and Ukraine, that any referendum in the coming days to try to wean Crimea away from Ukraine, make it part of Russia or make it an independent nation, if you will, that is unacceptable. It would be a violation of international law. Very strong words from the Secretary of State. Earlier we heard from the President of the United States. He also was very tough on this issue. Jim Sciutto is here, Gloria Borger is here. Your quick reaction to what we just heard from the Secretary.
Well, clearly the diplomatic path is still his preference, because he makes the point the reason why we put these sanctions in place but haven't activated them is that they want to keep the talks alive. He says they want to put the emphasis on the possibility for dialogue. So they're still leaving that door open for yet another day, even as things drag on. He talked about unity within Europe. Smart question from the Italian reporter there. Is there unity? And clearly there isn't unity yet, because otherwise I think they would have acted. And you see, for instance, a country like Poland, which is right next to Ukraine, it's called for Article 4 consultations under the NATO Charter, which a country can do when it feels that its security is threatened. You know, countries like Poland, they're feeling this just based by their position on the map much more than the countries to the west of them, and that's driving a different reaction to this.
Yeah, what I heard today from both the President and the Secretary of State is immense frustration about this referendum. And, you know, they're calling it illegitimate, unconstitutional. We heard Nick Burns call it farcical. And my question that I have is, are they doing what we call in politics a pre-buttal? Knowing what the result of any such referendum would be pro-Russia, and are they trying to put the genie back in the bottle here? And will they be able to do it, or has Russia, this is a big question, effectively, through the kind of ambiguity of where Crimea now is, annexed it one way or another?
Well, let's ask the U.S. Ambassador to Ukraine right now. Ambassador Geoffrey Pyatt is joining us on the phone from Kiev. What's the answer, Ambassador, to that question? For all practical purposes, is Crimea under the control of Russia right now?
Well, I think, Wolf, you heard the answer to that from Secretary Kerry, and it's a strong view of U.S. policy that Crimea is part of Ukraine, and we're going to stand by Ukraine's territorial integrity as we have for the past 22 years. Clearly, the events of the past few days are of grave concern. It appears that the Russian hold in Crimea is tightening. You had Nick Burns' characterization of the referendum announcement as farcical, and it's very hard to imagine any way in which this proceeds legitimately while you have the country under effective military occupation by unbadged Russian forces. So, but this is an issue on which all Ukrainians are united. I mean, one of the things that's striking to me here in Kyiv is the agreement you see across the country, and there's been lots in the press about divisions, but across the country, from Donetsk to Lviv, from the east to the west, there's a clear desire to see the country stick together.
Well, is it your sense, though, that if they go ahead with this referendum, and presumably the ethnic Russians in Crimea who feel close to Russia may not necessarily trust the government, the new government in Kiev, do you think that they would vote to secede, in effect, from Ukraine?
I don't know how the vote's going to turn out, but it's very hard to imagine a fair vote under current circumstances, without observers, with Russian troops on the ground, with great deals of political intimidation. You see that already in terms of the kind of reception that has been given to some of the pro-Ukraine demonstrators that have surfaced in places like Simferopol. So it's hard to predict how this will turn out, but I don't think it matters that much, because the important thing is that the Ukrainian government is committed to preserving their relationship with Crimea. Prime Minister Yatsenyuk has talked about steps to grant grant Crimea greater autonomy under the Ukrainian constitution. We have to remember the situation of the Crimean Tatars, a historically important Muslim population, which is very supportive of the authorities in Kyiv.
Ambassador, good luck over there. You got a tough job ahead of you. We're going to stay in very close touch with you. Geoffrey Pyatt is the United States ambassador to Ukraine. This crisis in Ukraine certainly could have a substantial economic impact on Russia, certainly on Ukraine, already has, Europe and the United States. Fuel exports and imports could be a huge part of this development. Today, the White House announced the U.S. Department of Energy will soon make some major decisions about exports of liquefied natural gas. Let's go to New York. Richard Quest is standing by. Richard, what does that mean?
What it means is if Russia decides to use the weapon of its oil and gas exports, not only via and to Ukraine, but to those countries in Europe like Germany, Hungary, the Czech Republic, Belarus, right the way across, even as far as France and the UK. If they start denying exports of liquid or natural gas, can the US pick up the slack? Can the US, from its vast and growing production of gas, particularly as a result of shale gas, so-called fracking, the US has about 110 different facilities for importing and exporting liquefied natural gas. Now, it's not easy and it's very expensive, and frankly, if you start getting the gas out in the United States, albeit at a fairly cheap price because of the sheer amount of production, then sending it to the eastern seaboard, liquefying it, putting it on a boat, sending it across to Europe, and then distributing it, you can start to see this is not a cheap or long-term solution. But, Wolf, if Russia turns off the taps and a crisis ensues, then yes, the US is now considering whether it can make up some of that shortness in supply.
Richard Quest with that explanation, an important development unfolding. Thanks very much. We're going to take a quick break, resume the breaking news coverage on the developments in Ukraine. You heard very strong statements from the President of the United States, the Secretary of State. Stand by, more breaking news right after this.